It's good to have you with me for another personal ponderings in the Psalms. And in this study, we're taking a second look at Psalm 9. It's another one of David's Psalms. And last time I pointed out to you how this psalm really falls into two halves. The first half, up to verse 12, is a praise for past deliverance. That section begins and ends with praise, verses 1 to 2, and then again in verses 11 and 12. And sandwiched between those two bookends, as it were, are reasons why David and all of us should praise God, because of his past deliverance for us, because of his sovereign and just rule over the nations, and so on. Now, the second half of the psalm naturally follows on from the first. The first half is praise for past deliverance. The second half of the psalm is a prayer for future and for continued deliverance. And just like the first half, it's structured in a very similar way. It begins and ends with prayer instead of praise this time. So 13 to 14 is prayer, and then again it closes in 19 and 20 with a prayer. And then between these two prayers, as it were, you have the reasons for prayer. So in the first half you had praise, and in the middle the reasons for praise. In the second half you have prayer and the reasons for that prayer. But there are some links as well. In the first half there's a very strong emphasis on judgment. We notice that in verses 7 and 8, for example. It speaks about God's throne being established with justice. He judges the world in righteousness. He judges the people with uprightness. And now he speaks about how God has judged the nations, but prays in verse 19 that God would continue to judge the nations. A couple of other things I'm going to do is very quickly. Comparisons, if you like. In verse 13, for example, you who lift me up from the gates of death, that I may recount all your praises, that in the gates of the daughter of Zion I may rejoice in your salvation. Here's the first prayer. He's praying to God, based on God's mercy, not on his deserts. Be gracious to me, O Lord. See my affliction. And rather than let me die and go down to death, as in the gates of death, because I want to continue to live and have opportunities to praise you and recount your glory and your steadfast love towards me, raise me up so rather than visit the gates of death, I might visit the gates of the daughter of Zion. And he's thinking there, of course, of the place of worship where the people gather together. He wants to be there where the crowds are and have opportunity to bear witness to God's faithfulness and mercy to him. And then he speaks about the fact that as God has judged in the past, so he wants him to judge in the future, verses 15 and 16. And here's a good lesson for us. The prayer for the future is based on God's track record in the past. So in the first half of the psalm, he praised God for his acts of deliverance and mercy. Now he's praying, as you've done in the past, so do it again. And we see again here how God treats different groups of people. So he says, for example, in verse 17, the wicked are those who forget God. They live as if there was no God. They are practical atheists at the very least. And we live in a world full of practical atheists today. So the nations forget God, but God does not forget the oppressed and the poor. He doesn't forget his own people, the hope of the poor. So I beg your pardon, verse 18, the needy shall not always be forgotten. It seems in this world very often the godless triumph, the godless get away with things, the godless ride roughshod over the oppressed and the poor. And it seems as if they're forgotten by God. But the truth is, it's the wicked who have forgotten God and the fact that they're accountable to God, but God will not forget the oppressed and the downtrodden and the poor. So here's a wonderful prayer of confidence in God, that as God has done in the past, so he will do again. But he doesn't take that for granted. He casts himself on the mercy of God. He expresses his need of God's grace and mercy, not to be dealt with according to what he deserves. And he ends with his great confidence that God will arise and God will act in such a way the nations will know that they are but men. You know, I'm recording this at a time when the world is racked with this terrible COVID-19 pandemic. It's touching almost every corner of the world. And I believe that one of the things that God is doing today quite clearly is he's letting the nations know that they are but men. All those things that they put their trust in, he's stripping away from them. And he's acting in such a way they're going to have to realize that they are but creatures, but men. And God is God alone. So let's take this psalm to heart, both of praise and of prayer. And until we do another study next time, God willing, in Psalm 10, the Lord bless you and keep you.